Greetings from Australia and welcome to this Australian contribution to the 2022 Veterans for Peace Conference. I am Bevan Ramsden from the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, IPAN. I live in Sydney on the land of the Gadigal Indigenous people, and we pay our respects to the First Nations people everywhere. We appreciate this invitation by the Veterans for Peace to include Australian peace activists in your conference presentation, and in particular to provide an overview of Australian opposition to the Australian, UK and US agreement called AUKUS, and opposition to war in general and the militarisation of society. The presenters in this video are all members of the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network.
I'm Fayeza. I live in Perth on the land of the Wajak people of Noongar country, and I pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land. Australian activism for peace and opposition to war, conscription, and militarism goes back 100 years to the campaigns waged against conscription for World War I. Trade unions in Australia also have a long history of action for peace. For example, refusing to load pig iron on ships destined for Japan prior to World War II on the basis that the pig iron would be used by the Japanese in their occupation of China. It would also be used to manufacture arms for use against Australian and other soldiers. In their opposition to the Vietnam War, Unionists also refused to load arms on ships sailing to Vietnam, and there was massive opposition to conscription and the Vietnam War in the late 60s and early 70s, including individual and mass acts of civil disobedience, the largest being a defiant sit-down blocking the streets of Melbourne by 100,000 people. The extent and depth of these protests was instrumental in bringing in a progressive government in Australia at the federal level, which ended conscription and brought the troops home from Vietnam. Unfortunately, this progressive government was brought down in a bloodless coup organized by the United States in 1975. This happened after Prime Minister Whitlam questioned the purpose of the CIA operatives working at the US spy base at Pine Gap, located in Central Australia. Opposition to that US base and others, such as the Northwest Cape Radio Base, which is used for communications with US nuclear submarines, has continued to this day. And there is a growing disenchantment with the military alliance of Australia and the US.
And I am Gwyther, and I'm speaking to you from the land of the Jagera and Turrbal people in Meanjin, Brisbane. In 2011, President Obama visited Australia and announced that US Marines would be stationed in Australia's most northern city, Darwin, for 6 months each year, and that they would practice war exercises with the Australian military, called the Talisman Sabre exercises. This has set up Darwin as an Indo-Pacific base for US military operations, drawing Australia further into the war plans of the US aimed at China. An airbase has been upgraded so that US warplanes can regularly use Northern Australia for exercises. US warships also regularly visit the port. This stationing of foreign troops in Australia led to an upsurge in the Australian peace movement, including the establishment of the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, with over 50 organisations, including peace, community and church groups and trade unions.
And I'm Kathryn Kelly. I live in Canberra on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. The former Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, announced on 16th of September 2021 that Australia would be joining a new Australia, UK, US agreement called AUKUS, and that Australia would, as part of that agreement, acquire nuclear-propelled submarines. This announcement caused huge concern in many quarters and began a period of increased activity from peace workers and those opposed to these developments. Within 2 days, on the 18th of September, a national online meeting called by the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, IPAN, and the Australian Anti-Bases Campaign Coalition to discuss these developments attracted over 100 participants. It was addressed by Dr. Vince Scapatura for IPAN and Dr. Hannah Middleton from the Australian Anti-Bases Coalition. The deep concerns expressed at this meeting resulted in the production of a statement headed, "Australians speak out against nuclear submarines and AUKUS." It commences, "Australia cannot become a staging point for the US military. We cannot abrogate our sovereignty to the US, and we cannot encourage nuclear proliferation and risk environmental catastrophe." Within days, a petition calling on the Australian government to withdraw from AUKUS and cease acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines was produced on change.org and has attracted 25,500 signatories so far. It was headed, "No nuclear submarines, end US dominance, healthcare, not warfare." It continued, "The behind closed door commitment of Australia to a trilateral security agreement with the United Kingdom and the United States, AUKUS, and a submarine fleet shows a complete disregard for the democratic process and undermines sovereignty. The Australian government must withdraw from AUKUS, stop the development of nuclear submarines, and end integration into the US military."
On the 7th of November 2021, more than 30 peace, anti-war, environment, community organisations and unions met nationally online to discuss the formation of a national anti-AUKUS coalition. 148 people attended that national meeting. The 7th of November meeting called for National Weekend of Actions on the 11th to the 13th of December, and protests against AUKUS and nuclear submarines were held across the country on that weekend. The first trade union to raise its voice in opposition was the Maritime Union of Australia, the MUA, saying in a public statement, "No to nuclear submarines, jobs and health, not nukes." Today, on the International Day of Peace, the Maritime Union of Australia, MUA, declares its total opposition to the reckless announcement by Scott Morrison that Australia would be developing nuclear-powered submarines as part of a military alliance with the US and UK. Well-known environmental groups were also quick to speak up. Friends of the Earth, FOE Australia, produced a petition saying no to subs. The Australian government must withdraw from AUKUS, stop the development of nuclear submarines, and end integration with the US military. This was followed by the Australian Conservation Foundation, which has over 700,000 members, saying on the 21st of September 2021, "Prime Minister Scott Morrison must give the Australian people confidence that this planned submarine deal will not put the nation on the path to nuclear power, nuclear weapons, and nuclear waste." Then from the National Education Union, the National Tertiary Education Union speaks out against nuclear sub-plans. The NTEU is alarmed by the announcement by the Australian government of its agreement with the United States of America and the United Kingdom to build nuclear-powered submarines with no apparent regard as to the costs to be incurred or regional political impact of the arrangement.
One of the first peace groups to speak out was the Campaign for International Cooperation and Disarmament, also known as the CICD. They made this public statement on the AUKUS trilateral agreement saying, "The CICD says this government is not acting in our name. Australia does not need this agreement that can only draw the country into another US war. Buying submarines that are offensive, not defensive, is a waste of time and money." The medical profession and faith groups were also quick to speak up. The Medical Association for the Prevention of War issued a statement saying the AUKUS agreement represents a threat to human health and global security. Please take action today and write to your MP. From a church group, Pax Christi, came this statement. This agreement, that is the AUKUS, will threaten rather than enhance Australian security by provoking China and souring our relationships with our neighbours, as well as with the European Union countries. National security is best pursued by peace-enhancing methods such as negotiation, discussion, and respectful dialogue.
Then on the 22nd of November last year, the Australian Defence Minister signed an agreement for exchange of naval nuclear propulsion information called the ENNPIA. This was part of AUKUS. There was no public or parliamentary consultation prior to that signing. The Joint Parliamentary Committee on Treaties then opened for a brief 4 days, the opportunity for the public to make submissions concerning this proposed treaty. Despite the brevity of this window for making submissions, over 100 community submissions were made, almost all opposing the signing of this treaty, including many on the grounds that it violated Australia's commitment to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Parliamentary Committee ignored that opposition and recommended to the government that the treaty be ratified. IPAN urged in its submission to that Joint Parliamentary Committee that the exchange agreement, the ENNPIA, be rejected and not be ratified by Parliament, and that the 18-month period for consideration of the path forward in submarine acquisition be honoured, to allow adequate democratic debate in the public and in the parliamentary domains.
It is IPAN's contention that the decision to acquire long-range nuclear-propelled submarines destabilises our region, and under the recently signed AUKUS War Pact, could lead Australia into yet another disastrous war. IPAN strongly supports keeping Australia nuclear-free, and indeed keeping the whole Pacific area, of which we are a part, also nuclear-free. We urge the government to sign the United Nations Treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. Early in March 2022, the Australian Prime Minister announced the government's intention to spend $10 billion to develop a submarine port on the east coast of Australia for porting and maintenance of nuclear submarines. The 3 possible cities were mentioned: Newcastle, Wollongong and Brisbane. That announcement sparked a community and city council outrage in both Newcastle and Wollongong, with community organisations being formed to oppose a nuclear submarine port in those cities. Both city councils passed motions affirming their nuclear-free status and opposing any nuclear submarine port being built there. The Brisbane City Council also affirmed its nuclear-free status and signed the International Cities Appeal in support of the Nuclear Ban Treaty.
The voices of Australian trade unionists opposing AUKUS are growing. In September last year, the Electrical Trade Union of Queensland stated, "The Electrical Trades Union has condemned Scott Morrison's decision to embrace nuclear submarines as one that will expose Australians to greater danger on multiple fronts." In November, the Retired Bus and Tram Workers Union stated that the RTBU Retired Members Association fully support the peace rally to be held on Friday, 10th of December in opposition to the AUKUS Security Pact. Further, we lend our support to the theme of the rally: no AUKUS, no nuclear submarines, no to war, and to advise sponsors we are prepared to add the name of the association as a sponsor of the rally. In March this year, the ACTU, it's the Australian Council of Trade Unions, Retired Unionists Network, stated that they view with alarm the recent Morrison government's decision to replace conventionally powered submarines from France with nuclear powered submarines from the USA or UK. The union movement in Australia has long been opposed to a nuclear industry in all its forms, and accordingly, retired unionists have no hesitation in opposing it now. Unions New South Wales also made a statement. Unions New South Wales declares its total opposition to the reckless announcement by Scott Morrison that Australia would be developing nuclear-powered submarines as part of a military alliance with the US and UK. They said, workers have no interest in war with China or any other country. Every effort should be made to pursue peaceful relations. Unions New South Wales stands in solidarity with workers of all countries in opposing war and wasteful and environmental harmful military spending.
The New South Wales Teachers Federation has been the latest to lambast the AUKUS and nuclear subs decision, stating, the Federation opposes the announcement made by the former Prime Minister Scott Morrison of a new three-way strategic defence alliance between Australia, the UK and US, initially to build a class of nuclear-propelled submarines at a cost of $70 billion at an absolute minimum. Indeed, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has estimated that the cost could be as high as $170 billion. These billions wasted on submarines could be far better spent on expanding publicly owned renewable energy assets to fight the climate emergency and to increase government funding of essential public services, including health, education, welfare support, etc. The Federation stands in solidarity with workers around Port Kembla and Newcastle who are fighting off this nuclear threat against their communities, which have been flagged as possible candidates for a coastal base for the nuclear subs. At a Sydney anti-AUKUS meeting in June this year, the Maritime Union Secretary stated emphatically that his union will put out all stops to prevent any nuclear subporting in Australia and urged that they be supported strongly in such actions by the wider community.
Since the initial AUKUS announcement, anti-AUKUS rallies and national webinars have been occurring in all major Australian cities, including Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra and Brisbane. An initiative by a number of peace and community organisations, including the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network and the Australian Anti-Bases Campaign Coalition, has resulted in getting together dozens of organisations and hundreds of individuals in the formation of a national coordinating organisation for anti-AUKUS opposition around Australia, called the Australian Anti-AUKUS Coalition. Its launching statement read as follows. On 20th of March this year, a national meeting of members from peace, community, environment, social justice, independence, faith and socialist organisations and trade unions from across Australia launched a broad national coalition campaigning against the AUKUS military pact and the acquisition and stationing of nuclear-powered submarines in Australia. The National Coalition is calling for a united front against AUKUS, nuclear submarines and a broad movement for peace and a nuclear-free Australia. We oppose Australia's involvement in US-led wars and preparations for war with China. We call on the federal government to divert the hundreds of billions of dollars earmarked for military spending on AUKUS and nuclear submarines to be spent instead on urgent and economic needs in the Australian community, including urgent action dealing with the climate crisis and natural disasters. The Australian Anti-AUKUS Coalition is campaigning in every state in Australia.
Australia and the world face two existential threats: climate change and nuclear war. Militarism and conflict diverts us from dealing with these two crucial threats. We are facing the prospect of a hothouse Earth with extreme heat waves, massive wildfires, floods and droughts. The climate catastrophes will only get worse, and human and other life on the planet is at dire risk. The culture of militarism is insidious and must be fought. The influence of armaments manufacturers in Australia has grown unchecked over recent decades. The sponsorship of courses at universities and schools, as well as sponsorship at the Australian War Memorial, is testament to this. IPAN, the Medical Association for the Prevention of War, and other organisations like Wage Peace have been campaigning against this undue influence. The military is one of the largest institutional greenhouse gas emitters globally. Military planes, tanks, ships and vehicles use huge amounts of fossil fuels, and the destruction caused by the military conflict requires huge emissions in reconstruction. The urgency of reducing greenhouse emissions can't be overstated. We are starting to build links with the environment movement against this war. The planet can't afford war anymore.
An independent Australia would have no real enemies, and we question the need for this enormous military expenditure, which is not for the defence of Australia, but is essentially to support the United States in its military ventures far away from our shores. We especially oppose the proposal for Australia to acquire nuclear submarines. That concludes our report from Australia. Again, a thank you to Veterans for Peace for our inclusion in your conference. And we express our solidarity with you all in the urgent need to address the march to war, to oppose the AUKUS war pact, and to seek peace and social and economic justice for all people. That is a basic human right. Thank you.